Yes. So just for the record, the last 2, 3 classes are where all of the theory comes together really and starts to be, they are the classes to kind of watch, I guess, over and over again. And in some ways, I would even watch the whole course backwards and start with these final 2 or 3 classes and then watch the theory classes as well to kind of recontextualize the learning. But in any case, we have all this canned. I have all classes except class 6 belief canned, and I will record class 6 belief. Okay, let's get into it. So there's so many ways to organize this topic of behavior at scale, behavioral experimentation, and I've not seen it organized this way as I have done in this class. So it's entirely my presentation, but the elements are available. The elements that I'm covering are available in most or all the major books. These are clearly not mine. I have synthesized them. I think that the one big thing that creates a lot of confusion in experimentation versus behavioral experimentation. If you look at behavioral economics experiments or other kinds of experiments, clinical trials, there's so many things that have an experimental dimension to them. In the behavioral world, we need to, just as we did with the canvas and we talked about earlier in the course, it's all about targeting, and it's all about what we can refer to as the behavioral event, right? And that is the thing that happens, the thing that is done, the act of behavior or the instance of behavior, right? And I was looking around to start with a good example, and this is something that I saw yesterday. It's kind of like, this is one of those things which you see in cities a lot these days. This is this bike is parked literally at the intersection of a 4-way bike lane. It could not be in a worse place because there's just traffic coming from all the sides, and it's summer, there's lots of bike traffic. So this is a behavioral event. This is an example of a behavioral event. And I thought it would be a good example to just kind of play with, something playful. And it kind of begs the question, why does this sort of thing happen, right? This is a behavioral event. Like, who does this? Why does it happen? It just completely sticks out. But while this is a behavioral event, just like, driving from one place to another or buying candy, all of those are behavioral events. We can also say that a lot of the actions that we take on digital devices and on technology are also behavioral events. So just to kind of be clear that there will always be a little bit of like overlap and confusion between real world behaviors and digital behaviors. Sometimes these digital behaviors may map to the real world behaviors. At other times, they might be quite distinct or just connected. So pushing a button on your phone maps to something in the physical world. That could be an online behavior mapped to an offline behavior. But in that case, we would consider them both behavioral events. But if you look at these 3 examples, select your favorite genres, or, okay, this interesting, screenshots from my new Apple. I know Katie's iPhone, Katie's smiling. Yes, damn, feels so good. By the way, I can just do an entire 2 hours on this transition to happiness. And
we've been encouraging him for a while.
Yeah, I'm glad I lost my phone. I had to lose my phone to find it. I went drinking somewhere and lost it. And actually, the phone showed up in a friend's place exactly after I bought the new phone. And then someone sends me a message like, "Hey, we found your phone." And I was like, yeah, that's karma. That's totally divine intervention that kept the Android out of my life for long enough to buy an iPhone. But yeah, I think I'm so happy about this choice because just as an aside, I think it's brilliant to spend some time on Android and come back to Apple. I started with the first iPhone when it first came out, and had a few iPhones, and then suddenly just stopped, switched to Android in the 2017 or so, 2018. And now I'm back, and it's like when I unboxed the iPhone and I opened it up, it was exactly the same as I remember it. Slightly different, like form factor. The phones, they have changed a little over the years, but the UI was exactly the same as almost like an iPhone 4 or 5 or the earlier ones. And I was like, oh my God, have they just been like selling us the same thing? And they have. And I think the beauty of the difference between these two approaches is one has tried to be an open platform and has resulted in a lot of variations, lots of chaos, lots of inconsistency, even though the open ideal is more, obviously you can appreciate it more. This closed ecosystem, closed approach has meant that Apple has singularly pursued a certain vision, and now all the little tiny details are in place. Like everything just works, and it just works, and it's so nice and easy to use. So I'm just absolutely enjoying at the level of details how many little things are in place. Anyways, a bit of an aside, but coming back to behavioral events, things like you don't see things like notifications here being done so well, where it's saying, well, do you want me to deliver this prominently, or you want to deliver it quietly? Do you want to deliver it in the background? And Google hasn't gotten anywhere to this level of sophistication in terms of the dialogue with the user. Continue delivering quietly. You'll never see something that subtle on Android. And of course, I'm also using a lot of apps, but all of these are behavioral events, and a lot of, just like targeting your target behavior is so important. Defining the behavioral event, like what is it exactly you want users to do, what needs to happen, is also super important, obviously. Okay. So then I guess what we want to do with experimentation, or really like with this whole behavior at scale, is kind of find out what questions do we want to answer, or what decisions do we want to drive around behavioral events. You have a thing called a behavioral event, and then what do you want to find out about it, or what decisions do you want to drive around it, right? So these are some of the questions. I'm sure you can think of more questions, but if you think of a behavioral event like the one we saw, the e-scooter parked just in a terrible place, you can ask a bunch of different questions around it. You can say, why is this happening? You can ask a predictive, you can ask a retroactive question, like why is this happening, or why did it happen? You can ask a futuristic or predictive question, like will it happen again? Then you can ask a determinant question, something like, can we make it happen? Can we influence this to happen? And also we can ask something like, can we change it? Can we change this from happening? Clearly, this event is not the event that we're talking about. It's not a desirable event, but these are still some of the questions you can ask about it. And again, the canvas is a decent space, is a decent kind of framework where you can define these things. For example, your behavioral events are defined here. Behavioral changes, starting, stopping, changing, kind of defined here. The why, which is usually really important, is defined in the second part, as we discussed in the last few classes around motivation. And really, will this happen again? How replicable is it? How repeatable is it? Is a large theme which kind of can be addressed across the canvas, but also it's quite a large theme, as we will see. Okay. So does that make sense so far? Just the importance of a behavioral event kind of being right at the center of this whole process of thinking, and keeping that in focus, and then looking at all the different kind of ways to approach that, or all the different connections to that, like the causes, how to trigger it, etc., etc. Does that make sense? Any questions or thoughts? Ines? Okay, great. So one of the main questions we kind of asked was why this is happening, right? And I think this is kind of one of the big ones, really. There are entire agencies and new consulting outfits that are trying to understand the why behind behavior at scale, where things get really complicated. And if you look at behavioral events, then there typically tend to be two dimensions of this question, the why. And some of these dimensions tend to be like, one dimension tends to be the qualitative dimension, and the other one tends to be the quantitative dimension. Does anyone feel like talking about both of these from your own perspective, or how you've thought about them? Because I'm sure you're all familiar with these terms. Wow.
We can say something, I guess.
Yeah, go for it.
I guess from my perspective, being more on the design side, a lot of our research is a lot more qualitative.
Mm-hmm.
So we're interviewing just a few people and collecting, doing like deep interviews with people.
Yes.
Versus the quantitative. We've done less of. We have done some, but looking at it purely from a large amount of people, like a huge database or something like that.
Yes, exactly. That's a good way to, a good start into it. Any other thoughts?
Like about it or what?
Yeah, about this. I mean, from anyone else?
Oh.
Yeah. Okay. I just thought this would resonate like quite strongly, or probably a lot of you have done qualitative. How many of you have done qualitative research here? Show of hands, maybe on camera. Okay, cool. Everyone's done qualitative research. Okay. All right. Well, I think what I'm trying to kind of establish here is that if we have this behavioral event at the very heart of what we are chasing, or it's kind of our North Star in some ways. It's both our North Star of the present, and it's our present moment, because we're constantly looking at the behavioral event, since we are interested in behavior and behavior design. So then how do these existing practices, which we've known of, qualitative and quantitative, how do they map onto that, right? They're both methods or frames, both ways to understand why behavioral events happen. I hope that that relationship is clear, right? And yeah, exactly connected to what Katie said, and these words sometimes help. What we typically think of as big data was in its previous avatar essentially called quantitative analysis, right? Big data is of course not the exact same word, but big data represents the same approach, where essentially, because of the quantity of data, because you have a lot of instantiations of data, or the amount of data, you're able to get to insights, and that essentially happens because of the scale. But what is being increasingly called thick data, sometimes small data, also you'll find articles on both these themes, you'll find books on both these themes as well, is that more qualitative thing which design researchers and ethnographers and essentially borrowed from anthropology and a field called ethnomethodology. That covers this, they all cover this qualitative approach, where essentially it started out with these anthropologists who said, let's go and embed ourselves in the lives of users, and let's go live with them, let's go relate to the environment and to their families and friends and live life from a subjective perspective. And we'll get to the essential qualities of why people do what they do, which is much more subtle, it's personal, it's contextual, it's very deeply embedded in a person's life. And thick data and qualitative thinking has a long philosophical history through phenomenology, what's called phenomenology. And there are, and researchers tend to specialize in one or the other, because the second one, big data, calls for much more like numerical approach and analytical approach and analysis of large amounts of data, whereas the thick data tends to be about like getting to the heart of something and finding the qualities behind the why. So the thick data approach, for example, even though we are spending, so just to be sure, when you want to do things at scale, we are designers and we're very much interested in thick data. We're very much interested in the qualities of why people do what they do and getting to the lived reasons, the contextual reasons for things. But we want to also do it at scale. And this is where things get really complicated. In fact, if you look at a lot of design agencies that service design, design thinking, they're very much on the thick data side, and they don't really address the big data and the quantitative dimension very much. And companies that do surveys and quantitative analysis, they don't do very well here. But I think we need to combine these for our own advantage. Okay, so these are some of the, just some books I thought I'd throw up there. Sense Making is by founders of Red Associates, and I studied with this consultancy, for example. If you read this book, it gives you a pretty good idea of kind of this thick data approach. It's written in a fairly accessible manner, but it's still very fuzzy. It's still not behavioral enough, but it's a good book to read. Cognition in the Wild is a classic, absolute classic. It's worth reading. It's written, was it in the 70s already? Yeah, it's kind of one of the early books. And then this new one, How to Think Like an Anthropologist, is a much more accessible and simple book. I just thought I'd kind of throw this out there to be like, okay, these are some of the key books on thick data, but there are many more. Most qualitative research books, journals, or textbooks will address this approach. And usually what happens when you have thick data insight is that you get some idea about qualities and brand, right? So as you can see, brand is a very qualitative thing. If I ask you, why do you like Nike versus Adidas, for example, you're not going to be able to quantify it and say, well, it's because Nike lasts 7 times longer than Adidas, or something else. You probably say, Nike has an aesthetic that I like, or Nike just feels better, or Adidas just makes me feel is lighter. These are all qualities. And so a lot of thick data understanding is about trying to get to these qualities, which then can help you form or create a particular brand position and dominate a brand position. So thick data informs things like brand, aesthetics, appeal, colors, appearance, feel. It's very much on this visceral and emotional level. But the moment you want to measure that, and the moment you want to see, you want to make decisions about how do these qualities, how are they experienced across the user journey, which is very important in digital. How do these things scale over time and across numbers of people? And more importantly, are they predictable? You need to start getting into quantitative and experimental approaches. Right on. So that's kind of like the build up, right? Any questions on this part? Or any reflections or anything? Okay, I'll jump into this. I think this is a slightly longer conversation, which is the attitudinal versus the behavioral. And this is the classic, the dimensions. So why does this happen? How can we find out, right? For example, I had a few different, actually, I probably ask you guys to volunteer. Why do you think this behavioral event happened? Do you have any hypotheses or any ideas? Guesses. Obviously, we don't know the truth right now, but that's what we're trying to find out.
Maybe it ran out of battery and the person didn't feel like moving it out of the way.
Mm-hmm. Sounds good. Yes, out of battery.
Could have been drunk
Yes.
during the night. That's like, I don't know if it's a problem where you guys are living, but I'm getting into this. Like
Tom and I live in the same city, so I totally understand.
Yeah.
The number of people doing drunk, like pillion, like 2 people riding on it drunk, is just scary in the evenings, in the nights, and they're going really fast without helmets.
Yeah, I got almost run over by a group of drunken teenagers on Saturday, I think.
They're all over.
Over here, that's driving a vehicle drunk.
A little,
drunk.
a little bit worse, maybe.
Yeah. Everything's bigger in the US.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
But to add to this, the person got to where they needed to go, and they're done with it. So they drop off their bike.
Yeah.
I think it's teenagers playing a prank.
Playing a prank. There you go. Cool. Yeah, this is very interesting. Yeah.
Also, there's no need to because they don't have docks, you can just leave it anywhere. So it's sort of enables this kind of behavior.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe that red light was just incredibly long and they couldn't wait anymore.
Right. Wow, that's a crazy long list of really good stuff. I need to write these down.
Maybe they left it there so that someone else could find it. I was walking along, I was crossing the road, and I'm like, oh, let me pick up this scooter.
So someone else could find it. I guess to a lot of those responses, my question, I mean, these are all great set of responses. Could find it, right? Drunk. There was something else about what was that about Katie said something about the mental, oh yeah, just wanted to spite people or as a prank, right? Okay. Tom said something else. What did you say, Tom?
Just that there's no need to leave it in a dock or anything.
Right, that's an unusual one. If you actually remember this no need to thing, there's Fogg has one of his motivational, one of his reasons, one of his categories of ability, something called social deviance, right? We don't do things that are socially deviant. And Tom is kind of saying the inverse of that. He's saying that because there is no set, there are no rules around what to do with it, you just do what you like, that there's no defined behavior around it, which is actually true, especially in a rule-bound culture like Finland. It may be an act of just expressing themselves finally I can just do whatever the hell I want with this thing because everything else I follow rules a lot. So the moment you move from a behavioral event to a hypothesis, you have this sort of boom, you have a lot of different things that open up, possibilities that open up. And I think a lot of the work that we do as behavior designers is actually to make this crucial step. First of all, define the behavioral event and move from there to causal or hypotheses-based thinking, which actually a lot of books on experimentation, all the videos, all the books, all the courses will teach you how to set up and run A/B experiments, A/B tests, how to the procedures of doing experimentation is very widespread. Like there's a lot of literature, but the thinking behind how do you think about an experiment? How do you frame what is the thing you're trying to do? That's what I think is really missing out there. So that's why I want to have this conversation. But just to come back to this example, I had very similar thoughts like you guys. My first thought was, is it just stupidity? Is it just pure lack of brains, lack of IQ, basically, because IQ varies very widely in a population. So there are a couple of things that are related. One is IQ or intelligence, basically, just being unable to see that that's a really terrible place to put it at. And the other is personality, which is just an arrogant person or a careless person. If you think of the personality, do you remember the personality dimensions? What are they called? Go by the axiom we studied 2 classes ago. What is the 5 letters for this, the personality framework?
Ocean.
Ocean, exactly. Ocean, yes. So which one of those would relate, which of the 5 OCEAN would relate to a personality that could do this? Openness first. Neuroticism.
Neuroticism
Is the one you're going for, but I wouldn't say that, because actually neurotic people wouldn't do that. Neurotic people are anxious and they are very aware of threat. So the neurotic person would do the opposite. So you need to have someone who's very low on neuroticism, but that basically means the person is very stable. So I don't think stable people will do it, but neither will neurotic people do it. There's another one on that scale which could correlate with this behavior.
Yeah, I meant narcissistic people.
Narcissistic people, exactly.
Yeah, which is not on the scale, but
it's on the
also
scale. But there is a dimension, there is a trait on the scale which has a mapping to narcissism. Do you know? Can you guess which one? Wrong answers are very welcome.
I don't remember them anymore. Was there somebody called careless or something like that?
Agreeableness. A was for agreeableness. And agreeableness is that trait which defines how agreeable you tend to be with other people, around other people. Are you someone who's agreeable or someone who doesn't mind or is basically disagreeable? This behavioral event maps very closely to someone who's disagreeable. If they were conscious, if they were not just bombed out of their brains, if they knew what they were doing, they'd have to be at least in a pretty disagreeable frame of mind to do that, because they're like, fuck it, I don't care. It's going to drop it, move on. Of course, there could be other reasons, like you guys said. So someone else would find it, that's almost altruistic. Wow, I don't know. Pranking, that's also on the disagreeable side. And then also this sort of like incredibly long red light. Yeah, it was really painful. So some of the causal reasons could be IQ or personality. I put down alcohol as well. Was in a rush. That was important to me. They were really in a rush, and it kind of has something to do with this very long red light. And we kind of touched upon these things. So, for example, when you're looking at something like IQ or personality, you're basically doing something called psychometrics. So you get into, if you want to go from that behavioral event, why was that bite left there, to if you want to get into the personality of the person or measure the attitude or something about the internal mental state of that person, the user, then you get into psychometrics. And that's one area of research and experimentation. And psychometrics are typically like, like I said here, it's conducted by experts. There are lots of poor tests. So you have to make sure you're getting a very strong, well-designed test that has been, iterated and validated over multiple times. IQ, I think, is like the most, in many ways, it's the most, it's the oldest and the most robust of IQ tests, of psychometric tests are IQ tests. And then all personality tests are also IQ, psychometric tests. Psychometrics is the broad field that covers that. So that's one direction to go. Then the other direction is actually things like surveys and, let me not go here. I want to jump in here. I don't know how many of you guys have seen this. This is the famous Niels Norman, what research methods to use. And this is very old. I still think it's the gold standard. It's the best out there is. It's online for free. And it's very simple and it's very practical. So, and a lot of our behavioral kind of design inspiration comes from all of this work, where essentially, if you want to understand how many and how much, you're going into a quantitative dimension. And if you want to understand why, how to fix it, how to change it, you're going into a qualitative sort of a mindset or a frame. And then you have the what do people do dimension and what they say dimension, right? So that's like one really handy framework. This is, of course, a more exhaustive picture of the same thing, where these guys have described all these different types of, research methods that can be used to understand these different, like to understand behavior or attitudes or quantitative or qualitative, right? And we are kind of somewhere here, because we're interested in behavioral understanding around behavioral events, and we're trying to do it at scale. But at the same time, it's almost like these things don't exist like in a vacuum, because if you didn't have some understanding of the qualitative aspect, you wouldn't be able to design these to some extent. And in a way, these methods have to kind of work one over the other to be able to get us further into the truth or into real interventions. Okay, so yeah, I'm basically saying that even though we are in the behavioral domain and we care about behavioral events, mapping attitudinal like patterns and data onto behavioral data, mapping the qualitative data into quantitative data is also really important. All right. So I guess I had a small exercise just to activate us around this, which was, if you had to collect behavioral data for this behavioral event, you gave me a few hypotheses here, which was long red light, they were just done, they were at the end of their journey, so someone else could find it, was drunk, could be a prank, and there was no need to. And I can add in a rush here. So if you pick any of these hypotheses, how would you collect behavioral data around that hypothesis? Just wanted to take 2 minutes and think about it. Does that exercise make sense?
We just pick one.
Yeah, you can just pick one and say, how can you, so if I should repeat it and I go back here, right? One way to find out why this behavioral event happened is to seek attitudinal or qualitative data, right? So I could go and literally ask someone why they left the scooter over there. I'm trying to find behavioral data which tells me why people left something over there, because I may not have access to what people say, right? So I'm starting with a hypothesis. Some of these are just my assumptions from my expert understanding. Or I could interview some people, a small sample, and they say, well, usually when I'm drunk, I do that. And when I'm in a rush, I do that. Okay. Is that why all 1,000 users do it? We don't know. So that's our hypothesis. How could we collect behavioral data which tells us more about these hypotheses? That's the discussion. Need to read this chat. Any thoughts? Any thoughts, Iris?
Maybe we can do the more qualitative interview first
Mhm.
to find out why people do so, and then do more quantitative survey afterwards to get more data from the behavior. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Do you understand what behavioral data means, or?
Not really sure. Is it
Okay.
like why people do so, or?
Not really. It is what evidence do we have of why people do so? So
I see.
you see what I mean? So yeah, I probably should have broken this up into a couple of slides or something. I'm sorry. I thought it would just be, yeah. So if we could, let's just do it like this. If we could take one of these, if we could go and ask the why question of why somebody did something, say, for example, they abandoned the shopping cart, right? Or they abandoned an e-bike, both parallel digital and physical world examples, let's say. If we could go and ask every single person who ever did it, or every single person who was going to do it, then we would never need to worry about like figuring things out behaviorally, right? We are trying to see how can we study behavior and how can we drive behavior by studying behavior, right? Because we can't do this qualitative by definition is small scale. It's not at scale. It's about the quality of something. And it's just not possible to do it at scale. So
Right.
while we can get some clues, and I think what you said is right, that we can get some clues about, you could even do a survey, and it would still be, the moment you say, by the way, just by definition, when you say survey, you're already in a quantitative like box, but still at least surveys are tapping into the voice of the, you get a direct response from your user. So it is, you do get that qualitative element in there, right? And you can do interviews as well. But then that's gonna give me a hypothesis of, okay, some people do it because they're drunk, and others do it because they're in a rush, right? My question is, how can we detect through behavior or get some signals through behavior if one of these hypotheses is true? I guess only if I give you my responses will it make sense. Totally fair enough. If it's too it's a bit it's not complex. It's just a bit convoluted.
Well,
I guess.
I have an idea.
Yes.
Like if we have access to the data in the sensors in the
Yes.
whatever that device is,
Mhm.
scooter,
Mm-hmm.
then we can
Mm-hmm.
check if the ride was like really erratic or something like that, or
Exactly.
also what was the time of day, time of week,
Mm-hmm.
battery level, that kind of stuff can give
Mm-hmm.
us some hints about it at least.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep, that answers the question. That's exactly what I meant, because the thing about behavioral experimentation is trying to figure out why certain behaviors happen when you don't have the entire picture. You don't have the convenience of asking, right? You have to look at behavior and understand it. And sometimes the only thing you have is other behavior, right? So these are some of the behavioral data sources. I said, well, was there a visit to the alcohol store? If I could track the user's credit card and see if they had visited an alcohol store. And I'm sure this is happening, for example, in China, where your alcohol consumption is monitored and your social credit rating. If you're pregnant and you're drinking too much alcohol, you lose points and so on. So visit to the alcohol store, purchase of alcohol the same day, and unsteadiness on the ride. Was the ride unsteady? Was the bike wobbly? You can use an accelerometer on the bike to figure that out. And I'm sure if you this is what happens when you have data at scale. If you only have 10 people's ride data, you probably won't be able to tell if it was steady or unsteady. But when you have hundreds of millions of rides at scale, then you can run an algorithm. You can put it through machine learning, and which is basically a way of just statistical analysis of large amounts of data, which then tells you that, hey, most rides are steady. Steadiness means this number, and this ride was definitely off the charts. And you can say, well, were there two people on it? You could probably measure weight. You could probably measure unsteadiness, etc. Same thing with the rush. You could, measure the speed of travel. You could even probably measure how quickly the person walked away from the vehicle, right? Based on their GPS signature on their phone. So a lot of the times, behavioral experimentation is a sort of like guesswork around the behavioral event, which is either why the behavior happened, what could make it happen again, or in some cases, how to stop it or how to change it. Yeah, that's the experimental dimension. Okay, so then we get into this whole issue of correlation versus causation, which is at the very central heart of this whole thing. And it's terribly unresolved, let me say. I read some research recently where guys like the leading figures like Daniel Kahneman and a few others, I think in their latest book, Noise, they actually discuss it, and there's some people disagreeing with them as well. So let's just watch a video on correlation. Oh. Sorry. Okay, I hope. Nice. Can you guys see the screen? No.
Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Correlation is really just a way of saying that if one thing is large, then another thing tends to be large or small. As well. I'll show you an example. Here's a scatter plot of movies, and each point corresponds to one movie. On the x-axis you can see the movie's length in minutes. This movie, for example, is 60 minutes long, this one is 80 minutes long. And on the y-axis you can see a rating of the movie, 0 to 5 stars. This movie here, for example, is really bad, it just has 1.2 stars, and this movie here is really good, it has 5 stars. Okay, you can kind of see that, at least according to this dataset here, the longer movies tend to get the higher ratings. And in that case, we'd say, at least according to this dataset, there's a positive correlation between movie length and rating. However, if the trend would be reversed, like here, you can see that the longer movies tend to get the worst ratings. And then we'd say that there's a negative correlation between length and rating. Now, the correlation coefficient is the single number between -1 and 1 that expresses this kind of trend. And it gives you two pieces of information. For one, it tells you is the trend negative or positive. So is it upwards or downwards? If the trend is positive, then the correlation coefficient will be positive as well. It'll be between 0 and 1. But if the trend is downwards, then the correlation coefficient will be negative as well. It'll be between 0 and -1. But then there's a third case, and that's that the trend is exactly level. So in this dataset you can see that the rating doesn't really seem to change with the movie's length. So then the correlation coefficient is 0. And the second thing the correlation coefficient tells you is how good would a straight line be at describing your data. For example, in this plot, all the points lie really close to a straight line. And in that case, we'd say that the correlation is strong. This slope is positive, so it's a positive correlation, and the coefficient turns actually out to be 0.92 in this case. And that's really big. But in this example here, the points are scattering a lot around the line, and then we'd say that the correlation is weaker. It's actually just 0.46 in this example. So the correlation coefficient's magnitude tells you how well your data scatters around a straight line. Okay, there are two things which are important to watch out for, because it's easy to misinterpret the correlation coefficient. For one, the correlation coefficient doesn't tell you if your data is representative. Maybe in my example I only showed you really weird and non-representative movies, so just because I observed a big correlation coefficient in these movies' data, I can't conclude that I'll see something similar in other movies as well. And then you have to watch out not to confuse correlation with causation. Just because the longer movies happen to get the higher ratings, you can't say that movie length causes movie to be better. For example, it might have to do something with genre. Maybe a lot of the shorter movies are documentaries, because documentaries tend to have shorter runtimes. But also documentaries might be less popular with audiences because they are less entertaining, and so they get fewer stars. So that's why in our dataset, the shorter movies tend to get the worst ratings. There could be all kinds of reasons why you see this correlation, but the correlation coefficient itself really just tells you that in your dataset two things, like movie length and rating, coincide. But it's not telling you anything about what causes this coincidence. Okay, to finish up, the correlation coefficient gives you a summary of the overall trend in a scatter plot in a single number between -1 and 1. Its sign tells you if the trend is upward or downwards, and its magnitude tells you if your data lies tight around a straight line. In that case the magnitude is large, or if it scatters a lot and then the magnitude is small. And in the next video I'll show you how the correlation coefficient actually does all these things in 3 simple steps.
Cool. Yeah. That's something about the correlation, which is essentially the fact that you can easily find other behavioral data or other behavioral event data, which basically has a correlation with our key behavioral event, but actually they just have a correlation. They have a strong or a weak or a strong or some sort of a relationship, and they tend to kind of move together as a trend. But it's not the same thing as causation at all. And this is another video which kind of goes into the distinction between those and why we are constantly how very often in statistics and data analysis and data science, one of these is mistaken for the other. Especially in behavioral data science, it becomes really important to understand causation because
Like most people, I enjoy it.
because we're so interested in motivation. It's not just the weather and birds, or
Tasty scoop of ice cream, especially
it's not just like the price of one stock and another stock, or the movement of one economy and another, or the weather and the economy. When you kind of look at these sorts of variables out there and want to predict them, it's a very different thing than trying to predict human behavior, where you have an agent here, you have someone who has motivation. So the difference between understanding what's causal and what's correlated is super important.
like most people, I enjoy a tasty scoop of ice cream, especially Oreo blizzards. But what few people realize is how dangerous a treat ice cream has become. First, there's the issue of obesity. Second, there are higher crime rates. Third, there's the loss of life due to a rise in the number of drowning deaths. And finally, as more ice cream is sold, there's an increase in forest fires. Given these indisputable facts, I need you to support my vision of an ice cream-free world. While banning ice cream trucks from entering your neighborhood may sound far-fetched, when it comes to problem solving, a common issue is misunderstanding the difference between correlation and causation. This misunderstanding can influence our decisions, sometimes with serious consequences that ripple throughout a community. Correlation is when two things are related, but one does not cause the other. Usually this means the two are in some way related to a third factor, but not always. If you have a big enough pile of data, you can find plenty of relationships that are purely coincidental, like the strong relationship between the sale of margarine and divorce rates in the state of Maine. With the sale of ice cream, the third factor is weather. When it is hot outside, people buy more ice cream. They are more likely to go for a swim, and there is a general increase in people out and about enjoying the weather, helping improve conditions for crime to take place, as well as the dry conditions associated with forest fires. A note of caution: there is a growing trend in our digital world called data dredging. This is using analytics to sift through mountains of data, hoping to find useful relationships. Instead of a problem in search of a solution, dredging data is a solution looking to find a problem.
Yes.
All of what I've just discussed about correlations does not mean that finding a correlation is without value. In fact, correlations are a vital part of helping us move to the next step, the discovery of causation. Unlike correlation, causation is when you can claim that one thing causes another thing to happen. In order to make this claim, you need to be able to demonstrate an actual cause and effect relationship, preferably a strong relationship. An example most of us are familiar with is the pharmaceutical industry. In order to make the claim that a particular drug causes a certain effect, such as lowering your cholesterol or growing hair, the FDA requires companies support those claims, putting the drug through a 4-phase, 12-step process that takes approximately 12 years. This process uses control groups and clinical trials to test the drug, making sure that X causes Y and that the drug is safe. The acceptable error rate can go as high as 5% for some drugs, meaning that the clinical trials prove that there's a 95% chance the drug does what it claims. Drugs with serious health implications, such as those used to treat a heart condition, are held to an even stricter standard, requiring proof up to 99% effectiveness. Back to ice cream. What about ice cream and obesity? While it may seem like common sense that it does cause obesity, the fact is that we don't yet know the true strength of the relationship. If we look at the sale of ice cream, there's actually an inverse relationship with weight. People gain weight in the winter when sales are low and lose weight in the warm summer months when more ice cream is being consumed. This might suggest ice cream is the new diet food. Luckily, you now know to be cautious of drawing conclusions of causation from correlation. Instead, recent research on the subject has been looking at different types of sugars used in making a wide range of sweet foods. What scientists have discovered is that the hypothalamus, which is an area of the brain that regulates the human appetite, reacts differently when we consume foods with fructose instead of glucose. This has researchers speculating that eating high fructose foods, such as ice cream, may result in people not feeling full, so they continue to eat. This theory proves difficult, however, when we start considering apples and other natural fruits also contain fructose, not just ice cream and chocolate cake. As you can see, causation is quite a bit different than correlation. Finding correlations is easy, proving causation is hard. No wonder it takes 12 years just to prove that a pill causes hair to grow. The bottom line, on the news, in boardrooms and coffee shops, everywhere you go, you will hear claims that X causes Y. From politics to the weather, from the stock market to personal relationships, it is human nature to try and explain things, to create stories that make sense. Just keep in mind, as you hear a claim of what causes what, that correlation is not causation.
Okay, kind of like a roundabout video, but I think it still kind of makes this point. And I think it took a while in statistics to sort of get to this point. Well, I don't know for sure, but there is this, it's an evolved idea to understand that these two things are quite different. And in many cases, things that seem to go together, for example, summer alcohol consumption and bike riding, those things are all probably more correlated. They're first correlated, and then some of those variables or some of those might be causative of the others. And so it's very important to go from this process of understanding what could be correlated behaviorally to what could actually be causing the behaviors that you're trying to understand or change. Okay. Any thoughts or any questions on this? Can't see you guys. Who's eating Snickers?
The classes. Courtesy of
Who's
Ines.
not eating Snickers?
Is that really? I'm not eating Snickers.
Ines is sending us all Snickers. Check your messages.
Oh, really? Yum.
Virtual Snickers.
What's yeah, Snickers, like could it cause us or could it be correlated to something that we're doing? Anyways, but yeah. Yeah, I want to get into the experimentation part itself. It's 18:10, wow, time flies. So a lot of people in design are familiar with research, but very few are familiar with experimentation. And I think a big part of that is because, well, A/B testing is just the way that designers or people in tech think about experimentation, but actually experimentation is kind of a broader topic, and it's really important to know the distinction. And actually the the other complication is that these two things are in a bit of a continuum. That's a pretty controversial thing to say because, if you just kind of think about it, research is research and experimentation is experimentation. But actually, if you start doing it in practice, you find that they actually have a lot of overlaps and they have some blurring lines between them as well. So I think the experimentation part is something where we can get really good. And I've certainly been trying to push it on all the projects, on every project that I work with, to limited or different degrees of success, you could say. But most of the people doing experimentation are either in A/B testing variations of a design, and we'll see what that is. And also, most experimentation happens in some kind of conversion context, like e-commerce, where there's a very clear conversion of sale. Okay, so why are these things kind of close? So you have the behavioral event. We saw that and we said, there can be a bunch of questions around this, a bunch of like decisions around this behavioral event. Some of those could be like the why kind of question. Some of those are predictive, like will it happen again? Some of them are causative or behavioral. Can we make it happen? Interventionist, right? And then also behavior change, like can we make it change? So do you see flavors of research or experimentation a little bit more on any of these questions? Do you see which of these might be like a research question and which of these could be understood through research and which of these could be understood through experimentation? Or is there any difference, or are they equally applicable?
To me, it looks like the top two are like research questions and the bottom two are the experimentation questions.
Okay, interesting. Any other opinions or thoughts? Ines, hello.
Hi.
What's up? Do you see
I
any?
mean,
Go ahead.
I think the same as Sia, actually. That would have been my thought.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah, I think you both are broadly right. That's why this continuum between research and experimentation starts to become a bit tricky, because will it happen again? But why is it happening? Clearly, I can see that as a research question or a research problem or a research exercise. Will it happen again? Surely there's a research dimension to it, but there's also an experimental dimension to it, in a way. Like experiments are kind of trying to predict the future in some ways. So we're trying to probe and see what could happen. And so anything that is in the future sort of has an experimental dimension. Same thing with, can we make it happen, and can we change it happening, or can we actually make a behavior change happen? Right. So you see, these things are on a bit of a continuum, and almost in all cases, we need to do a bit of research even to inform our experiments. And a lot of our research could be a bit experimental. And looking at the individual case that you're working on, you'll see that these things start to blur. So, but it's important to kind of keep in mind, because when you're having a discussion with your teammates or trying to plan a project together, very often, you'll see design process like research, insights, design. And it's like, oh, really? Okay, so what are you doing during research? And when you get into the conversation of what are you doing during research, you're like, that's where the rubber meets the road. And if you're trying to do something behavioral, then why not run an experiment in the research stage itself? Totally changes how you approach a project. So this is something I got from a book I really enjoy. It's from a book called The Last Mile. I can drop it into the book recommendations. But it's one of the few places where, well, actually the only graphic I found reading lots of books where there is some kind of taxonomy or sort of, or how would you say, organization of experiment types. We all know about experiments, or we've heard of them, and basically A/B testing has become a proxy or a stand-in for experiments. Basically, if you say, if you go ask someone in design or in technology, do you understand experiments? They'll say yes. You ask them to describe it, they will describe an A/B test, which is basically showing two variations or more variations of a design and seeing which one wins, which one converts, which one drives behavior more. But actually, experimentation is a much more rich and kind of like a much more like a larger palette of things that you can do. And really the span is between control and realism. It's between how much control you want to have in the experiment and what you want to measure, let's say, but how artificial it is to some extent, because the more you control it, the more artificial the setting becomes, because you are controlling it, right? It's not happening out in the wild. It's not happening in the real world. It's not happening just emergent in the world of behavior. And so those are much more you kind of have a lab. Basically, you created a lab. Even if I just sit you down in your living room and I don't know, like if it's about your living room, then I'm immediately going closer and closer to realism, right? But then I have less control because I can come to your living room, but I can't control the light. I can't control the atmosphere. I can't control the smells. I can't control if your dog is running around. I can't control the noises. So that's the trade-off. The first trade-off to think in terms of experimentation is, of course, the earlier stuff, behavioral events. What are the causes of those events? Are they behavioral? Are they attitudinal? Are they, where do we look for the clues? And then how do we design these experiments? How much do we want to control for, or how much realism do we want? And of course, we are, as behavioral designers, we are terribly interested in this part, the realism part, because behavior doesn't happen sort of in a lab. You can learn something in a lab, but behavior happens in the wild. But this is the taxonomy. At the top, you have laboratory experiments where you have hypothetical choices. You created artificial choices, or you can create them based on a hypothesis that you have, like we did. Was it alcohol? Was it, are you in a rush? What's going on, right? Those are hypothetical choices that we came up with. Then you have laboratory experiment with real choices. Then you have archived data, where you start to get more and more towards real evidence. Then you have this interesting area of natural experiments. And I think natural experiments, field experiments, and RCTs are really our domain, where the RCTs being right at the bottom are complex word randomized controlled trials, and they're usually large scale. The whole point about doing an RCT is that you can get a lot of responses. And A/B testing basically falls in that category. So A/B testing is a form of RCT, basically. But as soon as you can do natural experiments and field experiments, which are in the field. They're not such big scale. They can be 100 participants, 50 participants, 10 participants, but the setting is very natural. So you're getting as much realism as possible, but you're also getting a lot of noise, let's say. You're getting a lot of extra information. If you want to reduce all of that extra information, you go further up and you control the experiment more, and you're much more in the lab setting. It's a very broad palette, and I would love to, explore how a single experiment you can have many variations of it. But if you look at our problem, our behavioral event right now, which is the bike being abandoned in the middle of, or dropped in the middle of the bike lane, where do you think it would fall on this scale? What kind of experiment do you think we could run to understand it better?
Well, I guess you could do a A/B test that prevents usage of the devices during certain times of day completely and see if that stops the behavior.
Nice. So where would you place that sort of experiment on this taxonomy?
I don't know, is there like an insane scale as well? That's just like a dumb experiment, but I
No,
guess
no.
it's like a field, maybe even
yeah.
RCT.
Yeah, exactly. Depending on the scale, you're somewhere between field and RCT. Exactly. What I'm trying to point out is it's not a lab experiment. In fact, you couldn't possibly recreate a lab experiment. I don't know if you have ideas, maybe you can. We're in the land of experimentation, guys. It's all open to conjecture and speculation. So feel free to like wax your imagination, go wild. But to me, I don't know if we can recreate this this setting, you know, like 4 crossroads, traffic, weather changes, you know, moving cars, and this abandoned bike in the middle of all of that. It's a pretty messy sort of a thing to replicate in the lab. And so I think it falls naturally, like the realism in it is a big deal, and it kind of falls naturally towards the bottom half of this pile. So, but the key thing again is where as you move down this ladder, why is this randomization so important? And that's something that I wanted to show you a video about. And it's a very unsettling sort of a deal, this whole randomization thing, but let's watch it anyways. And this is one of the kind of the mysteries, or one of the funky things about statistics. By the way, if you are interested in this class, like in this domain, taking statistics is going to help you like crazy, because it's all basically applied statistics, all of it after a certain point. But we are in this special position where we're taking cognitive science and things like cognitive science and neuroscience and those other things that we spoke about, behavioral science basically, and using it with statistics. But most data scientists don't get into the cognitive science part. They just live in the statistical world. But we need to get some idea about statistics. Everyone's smiling. Okay. Is there something behind me? Okay. It's more chat here. I'm not getting any cookies or anything, guys. Simulation just part of a super large scale lab experiment. Exactly. There has to be a correlation, time of day and Snickers, or
I just wanted to say on the experimentation bit, like there are these companies that simulate experiences. So for example, if you're building a stadium, they would simulate how people would run around if the fire happens and they have to find an exit.
Mm-hmm.
And that's interesting because they have to then diversify the cluster of kind of those potential people, you know, and how different people will behave. But it does help them through those simulations to understand what would happen. I think the same with this boy or whatever, the scooters things. Like in a way, I feel like it wasn't tested very well. People don't really know how to drive them safely, and they don't really know how to park it safely either.
Sure.
So it feels like it was just kind of thrown into the market. People kind of hyped up about it, but you know,
absolutely,
that's wrong.
Yeah, totally. It was.
And also on this idea of adding a controlled, creating a controlled study, you could imagine getting, say, a warehouse or an aircraft hangar, like putting in a crosswalk. That's what you need. Have someone ride, like, all right, ride this scooter, come up to it and put like, you know, a space next to, have like a rack on one side, you know, or like just the sidewalk over there, and see what people do in this, you know, have like a couple options and
absolutely
do some sort of scaled down experiment like this.
Exactly. Actually, the simulation idea is super interesting because why couldn't you do it in VR? VR is something that's getting cheaper and infinitely scalable. You can throw in anything you want in there. But still, real life, like actually coming back from the bar drunk, or being in a rush because you have to meet a friend, or reality is messy and complicated. But that doesn't mean we can't simulate elements of it. Pick out certain dimensions and lay them out and study them, and then try to figure out what can change behavior. So interesting video on what is randomization.
Might this be a time to start qualitatively?
Sorry,
And
go ahead.
I said, might this then be a route to start qualitatively to find what are the important variables and then to narrow down on one dimension?
Exactly. So it's basically, the field is called mixed methods research, and it's such a vague field, and there's a few books on it, but there is no recipe at all for what would be the best approach for your next project. You only have past projects to look at, but like you said, we could do both parallelly. We could do some qualitative research to get stronger on why and see if there are some trends. Even speaking to 10 people will tell us, oh, generally seems to be if it's a weekend, then downtown alcohol is a huge factor. There's a lot of correlation between abandoned bikes and alcohol. Then we could move from there towards, okay, is that causative? And then you can start thinking of interventions, and say something to the user on their phone, or even prevent them. Like, what if the bike came with an alcohol meter after 11 p.m. on weekends? You need to blow into it, and if it's off the charts, it's like ciao, just locks up, it doesn't open up, not available. That could be actually a way to prevent some deaths for sure. I mean, or some super injuries, because I've known people who've fallen off these bikes, right? But before you get to that intervention of putting an alcohol meter on the bike or doing something or something else, we need to have this experimental approach to get there, because we couldn't just deploy alcohol meters on thousands, tens of thousands of bikes without having so strong validation for our intervention. So now I think it makes sense to you how the research, the experimentation, and the intervention design all kind of form this messy process together.
So
That's a
interesting,
great
by the way.
example. Yeah.
Yeah, just while you were talking, I was looking at your YouTube screen that's being shared. Like, literally, I think what businesses do today is they test and promote through influencers. They say, look, try this product and see what happens. And then they make a video out of it and it goes viral. It's just crazy because they get, 2 things done at the same time.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's look at randomization.
Why do researchers get excited about the idea of randomization in trials?
Wow.
In everyday life, we probably often say, well, that's a bit random, and we don't generally mean that in a good way. It hardly sounds like the basis of a solid healthcare evaluation system. But what randomization?
A lot of RCTs and trials, by the way, most of the literature is now, there's a little bit in the domain of A/B testing with the web and mobile context, but otherwise everything else is in health. It has to do with health intervention. So in that sense, we are also like taking the next lead, because we're just using all this knowledge, which was kind of designed in a very different context, and we have to adapt these ideas for our work.
System. But what randomization allows us to do in trials is create groups of people who are alike apart from the treatment being tested. And we would decide whether a person was in group A or group B by chance, in other words, randomly. And why is that so important? Well, there are lots of things that might affect the outcome we are interested in our trial. Let's say it was pain. And we could in principle try and predict or correct how those factors would affect our outcome and do something about it. But there are lots of things that might affect our outcome, and we will never know what those things are. And the only way of spreading those things evenly across our groups is to do allocation to group A or group B randomly. So at the end of the process, we have groups that are indeed alike in everything except the treatment they have received. And that's why we get so excited about randomization in trials.
Funny video. But I think it just gets across to the point. And I try to watch lots of videos. I know Jamie is so excited. Woohoo! Yeah, but that's it really. That's the gist of it, you know. And Sia's laughing. Yeah, I try to find more, like anything more than this just gets complex really quickly. And it's kind of pretty crazy that basically, since there are so many variables that we cannot control, there's so many parameters that are unpredictable, the best answer we've come up with as a species is to randomize everything, is to randomly assign, take a large number. That's why numbers matter in statistical analysis. But if you take a large enough number and you randomly throw people into two groups or even multiple groups, then one might be tall, short, IQ differences, environmental differences, cat lovers, dog lovers, animal haters, whatnot. Like all these crazy differences get somehow averaged out, or like they kind of balance out each other, and you get close to random samples. And the only thing that they are kind of being tested on is the so-called treatment, which is whatever you're administering to them in the experiment. And it's such an unsatisfactory answer, to be honest. It's like I've been trying to wrap my head around this whole randomization thing, but there's a phrase in all A/B testing literature or experimental literature which just says that RCTs are the gold standard. You'll just see that everywhere. They are the gold standard. They are the gold standard, which just means that we basically, that's the best method we have so far to test interventions or treatments, is to randomize them, which obviously doesn't work if you're doing like small numbers of qualitative research. You need certain sizes. Okay, so I think this was really useful. And always when you have a number of different experiments or interventions, you need some kind of impact matrix, some way to look for how do you prioritize what to do or what to run. And this is a very simple one, but I think this is the thing with behavioral experimentation, is that we really need to strive, like really work very hard all the time to keep things as simple as possible, especially when all of our resources are very small. So experimentation, it has use and impact only if it's resource low on resources relatively to your company size or your project size. And it's only those very few companies that are in this sort of a position now where they have both the millions of users, the hundreds of millions of investment, and the impact they can make through experimentation is also very large. So in some ways, the experimentation world is the most unequal world today. There is the most sort of, what's the word, disparity or inequality basically in this world, because if you're running a tiny startup, you have a few hundred users, or you're looking to get to a few hundred users, a few thousand users, you have a few thousands, a few tens of thousands in investment. What you can do, you have the same tools. You have qualitative research to give you some insights on what to go for, and you have behavioral techniques, and you have ways to run A/B tests or experiments. And the big guys with billions, they have exactly the same things, but they have all that scale. And when they can think of a randomized trial, they can think of it on a completely different level. So in some ways, we also need to ask ourselves, in terms of our career, I think all of us here actually are with small companies, except for Iris. And I would say if I was Iris, I would, and I occasionally have the large client, but to be inside an organization where you can continuously run experiments on an ongoing basis and learn from experiments and run more experiments, I think that's a really good place to be right now. That's for your learning, really, because I have some friends who run, so I try to understand by connecting with people who run experiments and learn from their projects, people who are inside companies, but then they're almost never able to tell me all the details because it's confidential. They kind of give me some ideas of what they're doing and so on. And it's mostly people in e-commerce, it's people in, yeah, let's just say e-commerce, or something to do with online sales, but there's direct monetary value from running experiments that who do the most experimentation. They do the most A/B testing, they do the most like variations. Yeah, and at the level of startups, at the level of small organizations, is almost never done. So the big dilemma is like which experiments to choose, right? And I think these are two of the easiest to grasp sort of dimensions. One is really the impact. Is this experiment going to have a high or low impact on our business, our nonprofit goal, if that's what you're into, whatever your project goal may be like. And then the likelihood that it'll actually take, the likelihood that it'll actually be executable. Both of these are quite, I didn't find this in a behavioral context, but I think it applies quite well to a behavioral context, especially the bottom dimension, because behavior is about adoption. You can quite easily tell what people are likely to do. You can qualitatively interview them, what they're likely to do and what they're not likely to do. It's easy to go there. So if you have something, you obviously want to be on the top right. And if it has a high impact, if your experiment has a high impact on the issue and it's also likely to be adopted, then you'd probably be, it's a decent first priority as long as it's not crazy expensive. So you'd have to factor your budget into this and say, can I afford to do these? And I think easy on some level, in some ways, basically means that is it affordable to do, easy and effective. And the more ideas you get that can be in the top right, the better off you are. And then you have, of course, the other options where it's easy to do, but it's kind of ineffective. What's the point? And then it's possible quite often to go into the top left box where you have a lot of interesting ideas, which could be quite effective, but they're terribly hard to do. The simulating stuff is one of those ideas. Things are pretty hard to simulate and expensive to simulate, so hard to do, even if it's quite effective. And of course, the bottom left is really pointless mostly. So yeah, I would say we don't have like the time to do a whole thing, but really what we're trying to do is, this is our process in some ways, is we're trying to understand what is the behavioral event. And in this case, I'm working with a specific example, it's a negative event, so you don't want it to happen. I took that just to confuse you or kind of give you a little bit more food for thought. You want to either change that event or you want to stop that event, right? That's your goal of the experiment. Then you're trying to choose what kind of experiment you would like to run. And we said, well, we would like to be more at the bottom, somewhere near a field experiment or even a control trial of some sort. We looked at some hypotheses earlier. We said it could be alcohol, could be this, could be that, could be time, could be something else. And really, the experiment is just like, how do you test this hypothesis, really? There are books that give you steps for experiments, but I wouldn't get into steps already because it's just adding so much more extra information and confusion. I think it's just better to say, an experiment is all about testing a behavioral hypothesis. Why does, and especially something that goes towards causation is always good. What causes what? Why does something happen? Why do people do something, basically? And I would keep it just as simple as that. And after I have a list of experiments here, a small list, hopefully, then I can put them through this matrix and say, well, some of those are hard but effective, others are easy and effective. Try to see which ones would fall into the top right corner. That would be the basic experimentation process. Does that make sense? Great. Someone was saying, Tom? Yeah.
Yep.
Great. All right. So I guess a couple more points. One is the design and experiment around this event would be a wrong framing, right? Because I think a lot of times there is a belief in the industry that we need to do experimentation for experiment's sake. So it's a bit like, oh, let's do some experimentation around sales. But that's too vague. What you need is to be very clear about, we want to design a behavioral experiment, first of all, and towards what end? Like, are you trying to prevent something or drive something, or, you know, essentially trying to create, prevent, or cause something? Because you're not doing research, you're not trying to understand just why, you're actually trying to make something happen. It's future oriented. Okay. The other keyword you will hear a lot is conversion, of course, and especially in the funnel, or when it comes to A/B testing, when it comes to sales, etc., you will hear the word conversion used a lot, which is basically the outcome. And it also, there's a lot of behavior on that slide. It is the behavioral event. What we've been talking about is the conversion, basically, is the thing that you want people to do. And also, your conversion creates the metrics in your analytics setup. When you have analytics and you have, you know, things like acquisition, retention, engagement, yada, yada, revenue, all of those numbers are essentially conversion or behavioral events. And you can create a behavioral analytics setup from there. Yeah, I just wanted to say that actually you can use the canvas for designing an experiment itself, but it's basically gives you the basis for an experiment where you say, well, this is the conversion or the outcome or the behavioral event that I want to happen. These could be the reasons why, and this is how the behavior could be triggered. So you guys know this thing. And when you have this one filled in, you have basically you have your input for an experiment. From there, you can design an experiment. Okay, some technical terms, or I don't know if I should do these technical terms right now or have a conversation first. Yeah, let's do the conversation first. Yeah, so it's not just too much. I guess my interest was in this here to say, okay, if you guys took some of those hypotheses you had, how would you go about testing them? I know it's a lot to ask from, you know, we don't have a whiteboard, we're not doing it in an in-depth way, but what comes to your mind? How could you, for example, test for alcohol use? Or run an experiment to understand alcohol use and the correlation or the causation between those two?
Could you use location information about locations of bars?
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, wow. Really good example or a good idea, yeah. Mm-hmm. Could there be a...
money.
Sorry?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was thinking, I guess the point of origin and the point of drop off also matter. So if the point of origin was near bars, where the ride started, probably there's a relationship there. Yeah, it's here.
I kind of thought that maybe there's something to do with money you spent on alcohol. or potentially drinks.
Mhm.
But I'm not sure if that can be realistically done.
Mhm. So how could we design an experiment around investigating this event or stopping this event? Does that make sense? Because what we are talking about still is trying to find the cause, you know? So Katie said, is there a relationship with bars and this sort of behavior? And Sia's like, are you saying, Sia, could we give them money to stop abandoning their scooters?
No, not at all. Sorry. No, I was just looking at what do we need to know, but you're talking about like an experiment to stop drunk people from driving, I guess, right? Is that the right thing?
Right. So what would cause
Yeah.
two kinds, right? One is you can run an experiment to find out why they do it.
Yeah.
And you can run an experiment to find out what would stop them to do it.
Yeah.
Right. So what might those experiments look like? What could be some examples?
Well, you actually get people drunk and see what they do.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, quite honestly,
right.
It's the happiest experiment people will ever have. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. That's a pretty good example. If you get people drunk, do they abandon their scooters more? That's possible to do on a college campus, for example. I'm sure some wicked professor, psychology professor has thought of it.
I'm also thinking, to be honest,
Yeah.
maybe there's something to do with, like, also check. Sorry, I need to get my thoughts together. How many people or how much activity there is on the street? Because I can imagine that people are more likely to abandon something if there's nobody to see it happen.
Yes, that is a brilliant. It's a brilliant observation, because that kind of touches on that social deviance aspect, right?
Yeah.
People do misbehave more when they tend to let their guard down when no one's watching. How can we design an experiment to understand if those things
There's
are
something
related?
Yeah. I guess there's something about like GPS. What was it? You can kind of see how many people are congested around the street.
Sure.
With certain software. So maybe that could be linked to a certain time, and then you could just test if that hypothesis is right by just checking the data.
Sure.
That's available.
Would that be more research?
Yeah, true. It's more research, I guess. Yeah.
Okay, good.
If
Yes.
it's an experiment, if
Mhm.
it's an experiment, then it will probably be. I'm not actually sure.
So a randomized
Yes.
control trial, and I just want to have a discussion because, you know, it's just to get you into the spirit of thinking about experiments really before you get into designing any. But an RCT would be something like, well, could be, you know, we will give 50 people, random group of 50 people alcohol, and maybe even a certain amount of alcohol, a certain type of alcohol. And we'll give another 50 people, random 50 people, no alcohol, and see what they do, right? And that's why experiments and incentives are very closely tied. Most behavioral economics experiments are tied somehow to some incentive. Give people money, give people a gift, give people something, give them a task, and give them an incentive to do the task. That's the format of so many behavioral economics experiments. And that's why there's a complex it's also tricky to replicate, because in real life, your incentives are not, there's no monetary reason for doing things. But they still try to simulate, you know, why people do things as much as possible using money. Okay. So that kind of goes into that whole area of framing it, designing and figuring out a conversion, designing an experiment, choosing which experiments to run, then figuring out the content of the experiment itself, and then kind of delivering it. So this is a good book to read, but it's, see again, Trustworthy Online Controlled Experiments, a practical guide to A/B testing. It's really a book on A/B testing. It doesn't really look at any of those other things that I showed you from the other book, which is the natural, like from laboratory to natural settings. This is a really good book on A/B testing, and specifically digital A/B testing, or it's the best book we have, basically. It is not amazing, let's say. It's just like these guys have been doing it forever. They're with Microsoft and LinkedIn and stuff. So they have also the advantage of very large data sets and the budgets to do it. So again, there are things you can read in there and you're going to be like, okay, how on earth am I going to replicate that with my tiny budget, tiny startup, whatever, or few users. So that gap between all the examples and all the knowledge out there and your reality is just a real gap. There is no way to bridge that gap except through your own creativity and doing things. That's where the state of this whole thing is, basically. So some terms, there's something called the overall evaluation criteria, the OEC, which is basically the outcome. Like, how do you evaluate? What is your North Star? How do you evaluate if this experiment is, been successful or not? That's one term. For example, the OEC must be measurable in the short term, yet believed to causally drive long-term strategic objectives. Yeah, that's kind of like a, very scientific, elaborate way of saying that you need to get it right. It needs to actually nail what you want to change in terms of behavior, the OEC, and then it also needs to be consistently useful. So if you find a behavioral change that's not really impacting your bottom line or driving your all-time long-term strategy, then you probably need to change your OEC. The whole process is very, very iterative, as you can see, especially when you think of the research angle as well. Like, oh, should we do some research? Should we define an experiment? What are the metrics? What are the tactics? Back and forth. And that's why I think it's just fascinating. It's entirely like theater or painting or something. It's a totally emergent, very artistic practice, you could say. It's not nailed down. It's not very canonical. All right, more terms. Parameter, a controlled experimental variable that is thought to influence the OEC or other metrics of interest. Parameters are sometimes called factors or variables. So the variable in our case was alcohol, time, lack of patience, psychometric factors. All of those were the variables. We're trying to see, why does the outcome, the behavioral event, leaving the bike on the path, what parameters could be causing them? And then the other key term is variant. Variant is just the different types of experimental variations. And now if you read what A/B tests are, you probably understand them much easier, because variants are the variations that the users will see. And simple A/B tests have two variants, and something called multivariate tests have multiple variants. And multivariate tests are where you basically have lots of different combinations. You take headlines, photos, something else, colors, background image, etc., maybe some 5 graphical elements, and mix them in different combinations and run them. So the thing with multivariate tests is you need lots more users and you need lots more data. So starting with simple A/B tests is a good idea in most cases. And then, I found this sentence to be useful. The hard part is finding metrics measurable in a short period, sensitive enough to show differences and that are predictive of long-term goals. For example, profit is not a good OEC, as short-term theatrics can cause short-term profit, but may hurt in the long run. Of course, the book is trying to be very, very, expansive in its case for business and so on. But that's a good point. Okay, quick video. A big part of running tests is how long to run them for. Again, here you can find lots and lots of complicated information. But I think sticking to the simple ideas is the best. Wow, we're already out of time. I'm almost done. Oh. No. Oh, Neil. I have no idea what this is. BlackRock is not even that far. Yeah, to understand how long you should run tests for, you guys should look at statistical significance. And I'm very happy to discuss these topics in more detail on the Slack channel. So do post your thoughts and kind of let's have a conversation there, because this part is so important.
You want to improve your conversions. So what are you going to do? You're going to run A/B tests. But how long should you be running them for? Hey everyone, I'm Neil Patel, and today I'm going to share with you how long you should be running your A/B tests for. The first thing you need to look at is statistical significance. If you're using an A/B testing tool like Crazy Egg, it'll show you which variation is converting better or worse, and if it's statistically significant. You need to look for a statistically significant rate of ideally 99%. That means the new variation is 99% likely to increase conversions compared to the original version. The second thing you need to do is make sure your tests are running for at least 1 full week. A Monday is different than a Sunday. People act differently on your website depending the day that they're coming to your site from. Someone coming to your website Monday through Friday may be a business person. Someone maybe coming to your website on a Saturday could be a stay-at-home mom who's trying to buy some products or services for her children or household or whatever it may be. So make sure you run your tests for at least a full 7 days. Last but not least, you need 100 conversions per variation, no matter what. I don't care if any A/B testing tool that you're using says that something's statistically significant. If each variation doesn't have at least 100 conversions, the data can swing and change on a minute, which means that you could be rolling out a version that's actually decreasing your sales and revenue. Mm-hmm. So make sure you have at least 100 conversions per variation before you decide which one you're going to end up keeping. Follow those 3 tips, and you'll be able to boost your conversions and know for 100% that you're going to be growing your revenue and sales versus making a change that could be hurting your business.
Right. So as you can see from the language, it's very oriented towards conversions. It's very oriented towards sales. It's very oriented towards things like, basically revenue and so on. And whereas this behavior change here, we need to remember that in our world, conversions are a much broader thing. They are a much more subtle thing. They are things that people do or we want them to do differently, right? And I like that short video from Neil because it just highlights those 3 really critical things. First thing is statistical significance of a certain percentage. He's saying 99%, which is kind of basically means that the likelihood of the behavior happening when the user encounters that variation or that design, that intervention is going to be really high. And it's a projection, right? Statistics is a predictive science which samples something and says, well, based on what this group of people did, the larger group of people are 99% likely to do something. And I think that's why he's kind of like a in-demand consultant, because his bar is quite high, because there will be other statisticians who tell you that 70 and up percentage of statistical significance is already a good thing and so on. So that's the key thing. First of all, how statistically significant are your results? The second is this very interesting thing of running it across a week, but hopefully you run your experiments for much more than a week, but really look at the differences between weekdays and weekends. And the third thing is this idea that, what did he say? The important one. I missed that. Let me go back and see what he said. Do you guys remember the third point? Just basically forgot because I was thinking of the first two so much. Not the variance, statistical significance. Not the test variation, but he said something else. I'll let it load. Oh yeah, the fact that basically you look for at least 100 conversions. That's really interesting, because if you look at what some qualitative researchers tell you, they will tell you that about 10 users is a good number to do qualitative research with. And so if you kind of look at this, if you kind of develop a model, which I'm just proposing is, for every 10 users that you do qualitative research with, try to get 100 quantitative conversions on the design. And that's a good kind of 10:10 mapping. And that could be a good framework for defining a research project. And if 100 people say, click on it, or they take up the variation, then maybe that's a decent basis to go for, a decent kind of basis to go further on. And the last point he made was really interesting, which was, you can create an experiment or create a change which hurts your business. And there is lots of examples of these. And that's really annoying. That's something your client or your stakeholder, or you, if you're doing your business, running a startup, really don't want, is to spend money on defining an experiment, creating an experiment, coming up with a new variation, which only hurts. You've seen it in nudging. There's lots of examples of nudges backfiring. And definitely there's examples of experiments that don't work or actually do the opposite. They hurt. We definitely don't want that. So this whole space is sort of fraught with danger. But what do? This is where things are with experimentation. That's why it's called experimentation. And it is certainly better than, actually think of it, guys, like I've been in this business for 20 years now. 22 years or so. And I think experimentation has only become mainstream in the last 2 or 3 years. Most businesses are not even doing it, basically, still. And that means ever since technology started, and there was an industry, until 2-3 years ago, people were just doing things randomly. They were doing surveys and stuff, but they were just trying stuff out. They were not even measuring them. And I don't even know how that worked. You just sell, and you grow a product. So this is a few notes from the same book on effectiveness. I just wanted to give it to you. I'm sorry that the course is kind of ending on a very sober note, but I think it's important to be sober about this. Avinash Kaushik, in his very early 2006 experimentation primer, he wrote 80% of the time you are wrong about what a customer wants, and that Netflix considers 90% of what they try to be wrong. And the picture is not very different in 2019 on the bottom right, where head of product at Slack, only 30% of monetization experiments show positive results. And if you're on an experiment-driven team, get used to it, at best 70% of your work is going to be thrown away. So you're looking at a lot of, even at a very large, well-staffed, well-funded company that has a successful product market fit, you're talking about large amounts of experiments being thrown away. But really, just on the upside, look at how much testing they're doing, how many ideas they're testing, how many variations they're testing, and how cheap. Because if you have to build 70 different Slacks or 70 different versions of a certain feature, imagine the expense. It's almost impossible to build that. But you can simulate them through experiments, and you can understand what works and doesn't work. And even if so much of it is being thrown away, the upside, the positive benefit you get trying all those ideas and for cheap and learning without causing users hopefully any harm, I think the benefits really outweigh the costs. And that's how we need to approach this whole thing. Also, this guy, nearly everything fails. It's been humbling to realize how rare it is for them to succeed on the first attempt. I strongly suspect that this experience is universal, but it is not universally recognized or acknowledged, which is kind of like the story of the entire technology business. Is basically 1% or less than 1% actually succeeds. Everything else fails utterly, but no one talks about failures online. I mean, I've always said we need a whole LinkedIn or a social network to discuss failures, and not just these even like just superficial successes all the time. Oh, this, oh, that, right? But anyways, so I think sooner we get into this whole experimentation thing, the more we learn, the better we're gonna get. Just want to end with the whole idea of want to remind you about replication crisis in sociology and psychology. There is a lot of replication problems. This is an interesting finding from some research where in the major journals of personality and social psychology, psychology science, other journals, the percentage of findings that could actually be replicated they vary quite widely. It's anything from 23% to 53%, or kind of an average of 36%. So 1 in 3 experiments can be replicated, and 2 in 3 basically just don't yield the same result. There's a lot of variation. The good thing about digital is that you can always do things in a very sort of dynamic way. Psychology studies and research that are not digital are much more complex and difficult, but digital products, it's live. You can actually continuously validate and experiment. I just wanted to end the entire course on this new concept of noise by Daniel Kahneman. That should be bias. Nice. But this is the new graphic in town, which is, it's a whole new, area that this book has opened up. It's called Noise. And it's Daniel Kahneman's most recent book, written with a few others. Cass Sunstein is also like a guy who was part of Nudge or created Nudge theory. And they've been talking about biases a lot now. They're talking about a new concept called noise. And it's a decision theory book. It's, as you can guess, it's pretty complex. And I've been trying to read it. And essentially, they're trying to understand this thing called noise, phenomena called noise. So essentially, this diagram was drawn in the 1700s or something by some statistician or something. And they have taken this diagram straight from, so this is quite an old idea that when it comes to decision making, you can have accurate decisions, top left, where your decisions hit the target. And then you can have biased decisions where they're all consistently wrong. And that's most of behavioral economics tries to do that, you see? So when you say that you have loss aversion, or you have sunk cost effect, or you have this or that, you're talking about a systematic error in decision making that people tend to do. And this is systematic. There's a pattern to the error. Whereas noise is something opposite, where there is no pattern to the error. It's very random. It's very varied. And these guys are trying to show in this book how these two states are different. And then this is a combination of both biased and noisy. So I really hope we get to read Noise, as well as Thinking Fast and Slow. There are a lot of critiques of Daniel Kahneman, by the way. So when I talk about these guys, I'm sure when you go out there and now you're ready to go and read some, I don't know, join some Slack groups, join some behavioral experimentation pages, etc. Hopefully, if you just watch the course again, you have like the language terminology for it. And you will find critiques, you'll find harsh critiques of all these ideas. And it's really up to you to form your own opinions over time. But yeah, having said that, thanks very much for joining me. This has been a complete blast, and I'm actually pretty overwhelmed and emotional. And yeah, I really just don't know what else to say other than this has been an absolute joy and pleasure to do this for you guys.
Congratulations.
Yay, thanks. Congrats you. Thank you.
Yeah,
Well
you made it.
done.
Wow.
Now let's celebrate with a fail festival.
Nice. Let's do it.
Coming this fall.
All fails.
Yeah. Yeah. Any thoughts or reflections or questions or next steps? Anything at all? How's this all looking?
No, it all looks good. I think Sia made some good, had a good message she wrote earlier in the chats. While watching the classes again and spending some time thinking about how to apply things. Yeah, that was a really good, thought, and this thinking about how to, I guess how to apply this like practically moving forward. All right, how are we all using behavior design to in practice, collaborating with our teams and our projects, being like, okay, here's the process we go through. So I don't know if you have any quick thoughts on that, Ashwin, because it seems like there's a whole lot of things, and maybe the best tool we have right now is the behavior design canvas. But that's also for one, specific, slice of behavior. It seems like. So you have any thoughts on this, on the process that everyone could take moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's the process really. The process is basically getting the whole team to agree on what behavior you want to change. That's the whole point of it, is to shift the frame to a behavioral conversation. And that's what you bring, I think we bring to the table as a behavior designer or a behavioral designer. And just try it out, try to go to a team that's outside your behavioral team, like outside of this class, for example. Go talk to a client, go talk to anybody and see what all they're talking about. They will be talking about all kinds of things except behavior. Or, and I'm not saying that that's always the case, but usually that's the problem. And things like project goals, our agenda, our company, our growth, our whatnot. The question comes down to, okay, what behaviors do we want to change or impact? Can we agree on those? And, or if you have certain targets, sales targets, product targets, anything at all. So it's actually really straightforward to apply this stuff in your projects. It's to ask, what behaviors do we want to change? And then go straight to the canvas. Then you have a path from there, which is, what is the behavior? Is it something new? Is it something you want to start, stop? How does it map to motivation? And then how do you actually shape it?
Cool. Yeah.
Makes sense. But then the moment you get into motivation, you can go look at motivation class and see, okay, what do we need to consider when it comes to motivation? what do we need to consider when it comes to choice or decision making or whatever. That's where the theory comes in.
Yeah, nice. I'll throw this out for, I guess, everyone here. Had the thought that if people have, I guess moving forward, we're all gonna, I guess the idea is take what we learned and apply it to what we're working on, our projects. And if people have, I guess, come into some behavior design problems that's kind of come up in their projects, like I'd say that we at least would be happy to hop on a call and chat about it. If people have people want to brainstorm, some behavior problem and kind of figure this out, of everyone else. Yeah.
Absolutely. I totally second that. And I think there's just like in design, right? Can you in 3 months do enough practice to be, to suffice? Never. There's just constantly when it comes to the practical stuff. So I was really hoping, and I hope for more workshop-based stuff. And the ball is in your court. I'm very happy to join anything at all. It could be just a hangout where we work on a case. For example, the Audible case, it's still out there. If you guys want to work further on that, or if you had one of your cases, see that you want to work on and want to pull in the others, and we try to do a behavior canvas on it or look at any of the topics in more detail in a workshop setting, super happy to join. I think that's the best way to learn further, because these things, you need to turn them from something that you kind of read or heard in a presentation to something that's tacit, right? It just comes out of you. So you've done it. You've got to get your 10,000 hours now in it. So.
Okay. All right. 10,000 workshops. Here we come.
Oh my God. But yeah, really more, and actually using Slack as an asynchronous space, there's a lot that can be done there. Now you have all these channels that have some idea of what each topic is about. Doesn't have to be perfect. Throw in an idea there and seek collaboration.
Yeah, about that, I think one thing that certainly helped me during this course is when we've been doing homework, and then, for example, I remember Katie once shared how she approached one task, and I just couldn't at all even get started. I was just a bit overwhelmed at that point, and it helped a lot to see how people structure their thinking processes around certain theory and how they then, apply it into practice. Because for me, the difference between this course and any other course that took on design, or let's say UX design and service design, were that those are often taught through some kind of methods or tools. And it's not necessarily a good thing, but at least what you take away is this practical applied thing that you can try and learn from all the time. Whereas here it was more on the theory side, and not necessarily theory that you can easily, at least my brain is very selective. I couldn't easily connect one thing to another, even if we've learned it just consecutively 1 week after another, so yeah, if possible, it would be really nice to stay kind of have access to Slack, and also if people are up to it, kind of share more about how you've applied stuff, and if you've created some kind of tools canvases out of it, would also be great to see how you've managed to turn it into something practical. At least I'm certainly going to try to do that during the summer, so we'll be happy to share mine.
Cool, that would be great. Yeah. Yeah. Hi, you're back.
Yeah, sorry, they're doing construction in the house and they cut the electricity line. I'm on mobile internet.
What? No worries. Yeah, I try to produce or give you guys as much kind of examples as possible in micro contexts. Like, for example, if we are trying to understand what's a schema. So my challenge has been this, Sia. If I started with a case, let's say I took, I don't know, like the passenger journey through an airport, right? A typical service design type case. What does the user journey through the airport looks like? What are the touch points, etc.? What are the backstage, front stage interactions, whatever? You can go quite quickly because the depth of content there is not as far as I would want to go. You could stay in a case and work with a case, right? But if I want to explain something called schema, and the schema is related to something else, and then it's related to something else, it's just terribly hard to do that always from a case perspective. And it gets very dense. It just gets really dense as a sort of a thought process, because you're looking at something that's nested inside something, and then that's something that's nested inside something else. So I try to have this balance of providing a case-based approach, examples, and then just theory. And this is what I ended up with. But I totally understand your take on it. And I think what I tried to do was to create these sorts of homework examples where you're like, you have to think about the theory in a case perspective, and I can easily create more. In fact, I have more homework examples, which if you guys are interested in cracking at, so we don't have to wait for you to come up with an example from your work. And the other problem has been that I did think of bringing in your work examples, but somehow those conversations didn't really go far. And in a couple of cases that they did, for example, with Tom's, we never felt like it was justified. Was it worth it to take all of your time in class to work on one particular, case? Why should it not be someone else's work case? So there's this dilemma between, can we use the class resources to actually crack someone's problem? And also the amount of theory, the amount of ideas that need to be shared. So that's kind of why we ended up this way. But I do think that if one of you wants to take the initiative and say, hey, like say Ava Gold says, well, we are working on this behavioral change problem. Could we brainstorm on it? That's a great way to go. Could we discuss it on Slack and look at how motivation theory applies there, or persuasion applies there, or how do schemas apply there? That's another way to go. Or if you want me to create examples for you to practice, that's also very easily done. So it's up to you guys. And I would look for initiation from you and tell me how I should engage. The Slack channel is on, and we can just continue collaborating, basically.
Yeah, for sure. I think you're I think you're right about what you said. Kind of doing it in during class time, sort of dilemma of like going through all this content and stuff. Whereas sort of like you were saying earlier, that seems to be a better fit for a workshop type setting.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's dive into our balance.
Mm-hmm.
Let's dive into Ava, and
Mm-hmm.
someone that we could just like that sounds fun. I'd like to just, we want to learn more about what everyone's working on, and the problem they're facing, see how we can try to help. And also
that would be very beneficial for all of you, because actually that still has a win-win, because obviously that takes all of our time. So we need to be careful. We need to be conscious of what the benefit is. But if I propose it this way, could we do this? Could we set up a date? Well, summer is coming, so I know things are a bit like difficult to coordinate, but let's say after holidays, if you guys wish, could we set up a date where we say we take a case, our balance, for example, and we say, okay, we're going to study the first 4 classes, watch them again, come back all together and do a workshop on our balance and look at how those ideas apply in that case, in which instance Tom would lead it because he knows what problems need to be solved. He knows what priorities the project has. So he would facilitate and we would use our brain power using the content of lessons 1 to 3 to try to apply them. Then we do that same thing for as many of you want it, then basically you all help each other. And you also learn the theory. That could be one way to do it.
Yeah, that sounds cool.
Okay.
Sounds like cool and effective. Getting some spaced repetition and connecting these ideas again. Granted, help each other out. That's yeah.
Sounds good.
On that.
So what's everyone's holiday plans? What would be a good date to resume? What would be a good date to resume learning on this project? Are we saying post-August, or are people back in August already?
I'm not sure if I'm gonna have much of a holiday, but
okay.
Same here.
Okay, good. Same here, to be honest.
Yeah. Same here.
Moving around.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that sounds good. Take like a few weeks. Come back in August.
Regroup in August.
Learning, it could do something sooner for sure. It comes up, but otherwise, a few weeks sounds good.
Okay. Okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I'm planning to. I don't know if you guys are gonna be like active on Slack or even checking it over the summer, but I've been kind of like working up to change a bunch of stuff about the app, kind of informed with this behavior design stuff. So I've been thinking of just like putting stuff in this kind of like project thread on Slack.
Please
that
do.
would be kind of like commentable. And then we can kind of see how it works. Like what's a good format for that?
Sounds awesome. Do you think I should just create a channel there for you? Our balance.
Yeah, sure, that'd be great.
I can do that. And Tom, let's resume our talks on the analytics, the behavior change, all of that. Totally good to continue that conversation, experimentation, all of that. So yeah.
Cool. All right.
Okay,
well,
guys.
Thanks again, Ash.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Class has come to an end formally. Thank you so much. Thanks, Ines, for initiating this. Thanks, Tom.
Thank
you, guys.
Thank you.
Katie, Jamie, for joining. It's such a pleasure. But I'll see you really soon.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Take care. Enjoy summer.
Bye-bye.
See you soon. Bye. Take care.